I still felt the loss and longed for my teacher, but the girls knew how to make the pain diminish with each passing day. I felt like a wax tablet, and the hands, mouths, tongues, and bodies gradually erased Aina from me and inscribed themselves. Yet, as Aina had predicted, it wasn't love. Wise Aina knew that she had been my mentor and master, a confidante, someone I could easily see as my equal and love with all my heart. To give her not only desire but also respect, affection, care, and friendship, to share every secret and heed every piece of advice. She knew this, which is why she was careful never to show me even a trace of tenderness. My girls were sweet and tender. They showed me the most elaborate caresses and came running at every beck and call. They fulfilled my most foolish whims. Whatever I desired, they were always ablaze with passion and enthusiasm. My chambers were constantly filled with laughter, as if I were keeping a flock of singing birds. However, they remained servants and showed it at every turn. I was the prince, the future emperor. They were attendants, and that's how it was to remain. I didn't go out to the city then. The situation remained the same. The transport provided the bare minimum of basic needs. Fire burned under the walls, and patrols maintained some semblance of order in the major cities. Every morning, several carts of corpses were collected from the streets. It seemed that all we could do was wait for rain. But the rain did not come, as if the sky had forgotten how to make it. In the palace, there was constant talk of an old idea that had long been intended to be implemented, of bringing clean water from the mountain rivers and glaciers to the cities, which would flow through the stone channels standing on pillars. These pillars would gradually decrease in height, and the water, thanks to the slope, would reach the cities on its own. The channels would sometimes stretch for hundreds of miles. My grandfather had once attempted to build something like that, but an earthquake of unprecedented strength came and the construction collapsed. Additionally, cisterns for rainwater were to be built in all cities, just like in desert settlements. However, as long as the drought persisted, there was no hope of starting any work. The last rain fell in early spring, said Levabelt, laying out the scrolls of reports on the table. This will be the 6th month. Exactly 10 days after that, the fire of the desert came from the heart of a Nahelzin, Nahel Ifrisia. And then it began, I replied. I still maintain that this is indeed wrath of the gods. And what good comes from this thinking, especially since the prophetess herself wants to think that way? Who met her first? The army. A squad of infantry from the 13th Timan, the Sanitymen from Kamisar. It was a post at a well on the trade route before the Kishlak of Shilgiris. Archers and a desert chariot. She told them, I come from beneath the earth and from the desert. I bring you a word of wrath, for you have abandoned the law of the underground mother and torn the world apart. You have infected the sacred womb of the earth with selfishness, violence, and greed. Now follow me, or you will perish, for I am Nahal Ifrisia, the fire of the desert, and I bring the holy flame of wrath, a fire that will cleanse the world and return it to the mother, so that all may become one. What happened to those soldiers? The commander survived, that's why we even know about it. Unfortunately, the man later went mad and hung himself. There were also merchants who came to the well. Some of them are now her followers, some fled, and the rest perished, reportedly in a sandstorm that arrived at her wrathful summons. Whirls of scorching sand that stripped them of flesh, leaving only bones. But at first, they took her for a lunatic. When someone comes from the east to Nahal Zim, and alone at that, it's clear that they might have sunstroke. They wanted to give her water, but she began to curse them until the commander set his leopards on her. Apparently, these are the same animals that now accompany her, only now they have strange golden eyes. Some say they are blind, while others claim they see much more. It doesn't matter, a young tiger. I don't know what this woman is, but everything we know is mixed with fables. In fact, she spread some of them herself. I think she's simply a doer, a true doer, like those from the old tales. One who perhaps has found the lost names of the gods. She should be killed for that alone. She's as dangerous as a rabid dog and just as unpredictable. But doers are said to be limited to charm spots, I noted. But she seems to go wherever she pleases. There have been doers who were changed by the sacred places and could carry some of that power within them. But I'm repeating old tales again. I've never seen anything like it myself. However, I've seen what happens when someone starts doing. Apparitions and monsters from nightmares appear, and they live for a while as if they were real. Miracles happen. Stones bloom, things change shape and nature, in a sick, twisted way. The same thing happens to people who are around the doer. They die, change by nature, or fall ill in strange, monstrous ways. Everything ends when it finally affects the doer themselves, usually quite quickly. Unfortunately, all the doers I've met were insane. Your grandfather wanted to use their power in the army, but it was a complete disaster. They would never do the simplest thing the same way twice. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, or worked in reverse. We suffered more losses from that than from the enemies. But here, we are dealing with something different. Clearly, Nahel Ifrisia does whatever she intends and succeeds. Can a doer cause a drought? No, that is too big. We don't know after all why it rains or why it doesn't. A doer can set something on fire, change or create something, but they can't lift a mountain and turn it into a volcano. And the gods? The Nadaku? Neither can they, probably. At least they've never done it. Maybe they can't or aren't supposed to. I'm just wondering, maybe Nadaku are also sometimes born and this Nahal Ifrisia is just a new kind, unrefined because she's young. Then why does she appeal to the underground mother? If she were a Nadaku herself, she would demand worship for herself. Besides, I've never heard of a new Nadaku appearing. They've been the same for hundreds of years, I think. This was what our morning report on the state of the nation looked like. Instead of analyzing trade, politics, and the military, we dealt with the drought and the prophetess. There was no escaping it. In the city, the streets were almost empty. Hone and I walked through sun-soaked squares, looking at the few open stalls, while passers-by slunk through the arcades and side streets. Everyone wore cloaks and trousers in drab, cased colors. Taverns hid behind closed shutters, and it was hard to tell if they were open or not. You had to knock and wait. Sometimes the door would open, and you could slip through a crack into a dark, stuffy interior where silent people with faces hidden under the hoods of desert cloaks or wide-brimmed hats sat. On the walls, one constantly encountered symbols of the underground mother or writings like, "Look to the desert, the fire is coming." But otherwise, there was peace in Maranhah. Everywhere except the squares and the temple where water was distributed, there was always a crowd, but it was a strange peace, dead and terrifying. An air of anticipation hung over everything, as if a storm was coming or a volcano was going to erupt. At intersections stood tents made of spears and cloaks, with soldiers sitting in them, their faces red and their sunburned arms uncovered, without helmets and with their heads wrapped in wet cloths. It was not only hot, but also suffocating, and the air was thick with flies. And then that night came. The dreadful night of the second moon's full phase. I slept a light, sickly sleep, drenched in sweat, waking up many times and feeling as though I wasn't sleeping at all, just lying in the dark, looking at the night garden and listening to soft breath of my girls. But I must have been dreaming, because it seemed to me that I had a hooded figure coming from the direction of a lake. They wore a very wide cloak, glowing with a bright red, flaring out at the bottom, with hands hidden in wide sleeves. I didn't see the face, just the oval hole of a hood filled with darkness. The cloak fluttered slightly and floated as if it were the thinnest muslin or crumpled thin parchment, and it shone with a red-orange glow, casting a dull, ruddy light on the lake, grass, and bushes. Everything around flickered, and on the patio stood the hooded, shadowy figure dressed in a cloak of flames. I knew what I was looking at. It was Nahali Frisia, the fire of the desert. She had come for me. I woke up with a feeling of falling. I was back in my bedroom, soaked in sweat, looking at the garden. I heard the whispers of my girls, so soft and delicate that I would have taken them for the rustling of wind in the leaves, except that there has been no wind for months. Besides, I felt a tickling on my chest as if a fly were walking on it. Hold his legs, lie down on them. I recognized Tahela's voice. Maybe he won't wake up. I had never been so terrified in my life. You sit on his shoulders, Fiala whispered. I heard the faint scrape of a knife being drawn from its sheath. I opened my eyes, and many things happened at once. First of all, there was a hideous insect on my chest, segmented, walking on 8 jointed legs, covered in a brown shell, with a flat head ending in hook-like jaws. It was the size of my hand. I looked straight into its 4 eyes, which gleamed faintly like jewels. Before I could move, Irisa threw herself entirely onto my legs, and Tahela suddenly emerged from the darkness behind my head, kneeling on my shoulders, sitting on my face, and squeezing my head with her thighs. I shuddered, feeling the cold touch of steel on my chest, but then I realized they weren't trying to stab me. Fiala slipped the knife under the insect sitting on my chest and swiftly flipped it into the air. Tahela lifted herself off my face, and I managed to see the creature writhing in the air like a snake before it landed heavily on the floor. It fell onto its back, frantically moving its legs, then suddenly arced and pushed off the floor with its jaws. Tahela darted like a weasel, grabbed a crystal ball full of fruits, dumped them out, and threw herself on the floor, covering the creature with the ball. "Call the guards!" she shouted, "and light a lamp. There might be more of them." I heard a crack of a fire striker, and a flickering light filled the room. Irisa rolled off my legs. I sat up on the bed and started laughing. And then I saw him, dressed in a dark red robe that, until we lit the lamp, was just a blotch of darkness in the shadows. Even his face was wrapped in a veil. He stood motionless by the pool, exactly where I had seen the hooded apparition in my dream. I screamed, jumping to my feet, and grabbed a sword from the stand. "Guards! There's a spy in the castle!" Tahela screamed wildly. I threw off a scabbard from the sword, and at that moment the masked assailant stood up and made a sudden gesture with his hand. Something whistled. Irisa jumped, crashing into me with her back, pushing me backwards so I couldn't attack. "Get out of the way, girl, or he'll escape!" I shouted, dodging, and charged at him. The assailant's robe fluttered and he twisted in place like a fox, jerking to the side. A narrow blade flashed in the air. I parried it and slashed at his forehead, but he managed to dodge and quickly stabbed at my eyes. I wouldn't have been able to block it even if I had practiced fencing for a lifetime. But at that moment, a large, dark disc flew out from the room and struck him in the hand with a metallic clang. It was only a split second, but I managed to use it, driving my blade deep in his stomach. I felt it pierce the folds of his robe and lodge in his guts. The silver tray clattered across the stones of the terrace and rolled into the grass. "Ifrisia!" he wheezed, collapsing onto me, impaling himself on the blade all the way to the hilt. The blade emerged from his back with a sound of a tearing fabric. I jumped back, unable to free the sword. The assassin took a lurching step towards me, reaching out, but only managed to graze my chest with his fingers, leaving smears of blood on my skin. Tahela crashed into him with her entire body, shrieking wildly, and they tumbled off the terrace. I leaped after her, but she was already sitting on his chest, stabbing him repeatedly with a sword held in both hands. I grabbed her hands, hugged her tightly, and gently took the weapon from her grip. It's over, I whispered, holding her close. She had wild eyes and foam at the corners of her mouth. Irisa, she wailed in a terrible voice. I turned around. Irisa was still standing in the same place by the bed, where she had fallen on me. Her eyes were wide open, and her fist clenched, and right between her breasts was a knife with a wide blade, held down, as if it had stuck to her body. I rushed to her and grabbed her by the shoulders. Irisa suddenly coughed and spat out red saliva, and a moment later, a stream of blood flowed from her mouth, down her chin, and at the length of her stomach. I laid her on the ground, holding her in my arms. I heard a terrible wild scream of God, medic! And then I realized that it was I who was screaming. The blade sticking out of her chest had a handle wrapped in leather and a bizarre blade, branching out in all directions with sharp edges like a leaf. One of those edges were now embedded in the body of my sweet Irisa instead of mine. Apparently, when they finally arrived, I was still kneeling, holding Irisa, covered in blood, and letting out wild, hoarse howls that sounded like a wolf's voice. I didn't allow them to take her body for a long time, even though it was already cold. He got over the wall. I don't know how. We found 3 guards with their throats cut, and one with wounds from the same blade that killed Irisa. Leverbelt spoke firmly and matter-of-factly, but it was clear that he was furious. Enough of this, the Emperor hissed. The assassin reportedly died with a prophetess name on his lips. This is an attack on the Tiger Throne. Immediately prepare a plan to strike at the Red Towers. All the priests are to be arrested. Wherever traces of human blood sacrifices are found, all the priests are to be executed. The towers should be demolished, and all wealth and supplies confiscated. They will serve the victims of the draft. A reward is offered for the prophetess known as the Fire of the Desert. 1,000 dirhams for her, dead, and only dead. The cult of the Underground Mother is declared illegal. Anyone found carrying its symbols, wearing its robes, or publicly invoking that Nadaku will be arrested and placed on war galleys for 3 years. For invoking the code of the earth and threatening anyone with death or a curse, 5 years. He stood up. And one more thing. I forbid honorable suicides. The commander of the bodyguard impaled himself on his sword. Meanwhile, I needed him. I need everyone now. Father, I croaked. I felt as if I had a desert in my throat. I no longer felt sadness, just a dull anger, cold as ice. I knew this anger would stay with me for a long time. Maybe forever. Yes, young tiger. Irisa saved my life. She shielded me from that blade. I humbly ask that she be buried in the Garden of Silence with a ritual due to a war hero. Very well. She will be posthumously awarded the rank of a Pahandei of a god. Her family will receive the customary grants, as for an officer's death in war. Was she your concubine? Father, I humbly ask that you officially make her my first concubine. Agreed.